Have any questions, please jump in if you have any questions about today's presentation. All right. So we are going to talk about digestion. That's what we're going to focus on. We've already went over the respiratory system. So today we're going to go over digestion, right? But I wanted to point out something that's important, and that is that these three systems actually they work together. Okay. So, for example, on this slide is a beautiful image of mitochondria. You remember mitochondria make energy by converting food into energy, and the way they do that is they use oxygen. So for mitochondria to make energy, they need two things. Okay, they need oxygen, and we know that comes from the respiratory system, and they need food, which will come from your digestive system. So they need these two things to make energy. The circulatory system is then what distributes these chemicals so that the mitochondria pick it up. So you can see that all these three systems work together. So we've covered the respiratory system. Now we're going to talk about digestion. Okay. So digestion, we're going to just do like a basic overview of it. So here's what we use it for. We use digestion for certain important things like making compounds in our body. So hemoglobin, insulin, for example, are things that, if you remember, these are proteins. So if you tie it back to what we talked about at the beginning of the cell and what a cell does is, remember, the proteins are made by ribosomes, which read DNA. So these things basically are encoded in your DNA. But to make them, you can't just make them out of thin air. You can't make hemoglobin and insulin out of thin air. You need raw materials to make hemoglobin and insulin, right? And this is true if you go think back to, for example, even like making like the cell membrane itself, or making the nuclear membrane, or making transporter proteins, right? These are all things that the cell knows how to do because it's encoded in the DNA how to make these things. But the DNA is just a recipe, and you can't make a pizza with just the recipe. You need the materials to make the pizza too. So digestive system brings in the materials to make things like hemoglobin, insulin, transporters. All right. So that's one of the reasons why the digestive system is so important. The other reason is things like growing, things like repairing, that requires raw materials too. And that's why we need to eat, to provide the raw materials to get bigger and to, fix any damaged areas. And thirdly, to make energy, because food, some of it is converted into energy. Okay, so we're going to kind of talk about how the digestive system does this. How does it bring in these materials so that we could, make energy, grow, make other things? So the digestive system itself, we can break it up into like phases or stages. Here are four. So we have ingestion. That's the act of bringing food in. Digestion is the act of actually breaking up food. Make that a little bit bigger. Absorption is the act of actually getting the food into your bloodstream. And then egestion is the act of eliminating anything that we don't absorb. Because there are going to be things that you can't absorb. Okay. So now here's the interesting thing. Not all organisms have a complete digestive system. Okay. So we are going to focus on humans and the human digestive system, which is going to be very similar to all mammals, pretty much, okay, with some slight modifications. So we are going to look at what's called a complete digestive system, which means that there's a beginning and there's an end that basically forms like one long tube. And, that's true for us too. So, the entry point of your digestive system is your mouth. You're sitting on the exit point. It's not a straight tube. So it doesn't look like what you're seeing on my screen, but it's similar. This is also known as a complete digestive system because there is an entry point here and there's an exit point there. So the food would travel one way and out, all right? Whereas things that don't have a complete digestive system, you would see the food can go in, but it doesn't come out. There's no other end. So it's not like a complete tube. Basically, the food would come in, get digested, and then get spit back out. All right, but that's not what we're going to look at. We're going to look at how mammals digest food, okay? All right, so let's start with ingestion. Spent a little bit of time on, very little time on ingestion. So here was a nasty picture of a spider. I don't know if you can make out the frog. This poor frog got ambushed by a spider. Now, not all things need to swallow their food. On the right, you are seeing that. There's some birds swallowing a fish. On the left, you're seeing something different. So not all animals swallow their food. Some animals will literally just drink the fluid, kind of like almost like putting a straw in glass and drinking. This is what a spider does basically. So a spider doesn't swallow its food. What it does is it injects chemicals into its prey. Those chemicals then turn that frog, the inside of that frog, into frog soup. And then the spider would then suck up those tasty juices. Okay. But obviously we don't do that. Well, we're a little bit more similar to what the bird does than what the spider does, right? But one of the things that we do very often is when we ingest is we chew. So why do we chew our food? So here is, if you're afraid of snakes, I guess don't look, but here is a scary picture. This is a big, scary python eating an impala. An impala is kind of like I'm going to say a mini deer, okay? Although it's not a deer at all, but I'm just going to say like a mini deer if you've ever seen like an impala before. Now, snakes don't chew their food, okay? We do. So what is the advantage of actually chewing your food? I wanted to bring this up because this is actually a nice little tie-in to chemistry. And also, this came up in biology last lesson when we talked about surface area. When you chew your food, what you're doing is you're breaking it up into little pieces. So imagine, for example, and I have two images of this. So imagine this is food, and we break it up into little pieces. And you're seeing the same thing over here. Imagine this is our food, and you break it up into little pieces, right? When you do that, what happens is the surface area of those pieces of food increase. Because if I look at this block, for example, you'll notice that as I break it up into little pieces, there are new surfaces that get exposed. So it's probably easy to see it maybe right here. So here is a block. If I cut that block in half, see this new surface now that's being exposed. So the surface in the middle right now is not exposed, but if I cut it, then I have new surface now that I'm just going to highlight here in red. If I cut it again this way, then you can see I'm exposing more and more surface. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it goes back to what we talked about with respiration. When you have a bigger surface area, things happen at a faster rate. And you can see that in this graph here. So here is, for example, let's say we have a powder, and this is a sort of like what's called a reaction rate. You'll notice that when you have a powder, the reaction rate is pretty fast. So this steep line represents a really quick reaction rate. But if it's not a powder, if it's in like little pieces, the reaction rate is slower. So what this means is that if the more I chew my food, the more it's like a powder, the faster it will get digested. That's what this simply means, all right? So, I was like, okay, so then if a snake doesn't chew its food, that means that the deer, or impala in this case, doesn't get broken up into little pieces. So does that mean that the snake takes a really long time to digest their food? Because digestion is a reaction. And this graph says that, if we break it up into smaller pieces, then the rate is faster. So obviously, if we don't break it up, the rate must be pretty slow, really slow. So I was looking it up, and apparently for snakes, it could take up to like 10 days, maybe possibly, I don't know, about 2 weeks to digest something like what it's digesting right now. So this impala that it's eating would take probably about 10 days to digest. And that's because the snake isn't breaking it up into little pieces. So the advantage of breaking up things into little pieces, well, A is we don't have to do what the snake is doing, which looks kind of tough. That doesn't look very easy. And B, it also helps us just digest our food really, really quickly. So, and the other advantage of chewing is you don't have to eat everything by swallowing it, right? Like if it doesn't fit in your mouth, like an apple doesn't fit in your mouth, you don't need to swallow the whole apple. You can just take little bites. So obviously, chewing is very, very beneficial for digestion. Now, that's the first, that's ingestion. What about the act of digestion? So that's the second part, right? Once the food gets in, whether you swallow it or you chew it into little pieces and then swallow it, what happens? So the food goes through a sequence, which is, summarized on this slide, and you could see it here. So the food is going to, let's change that color. Let's do blue. So the food is going to enter through your mouth, and it's going to go into what's called your esophagus, right? This is the esophagus. Now, the pharynx is actually at the back of your mouth, and it actually connects not only to the esophagus, but it also connects to the trachea. That's from the last section on the respiratory system. So there is a little flap, which you can't see in this slide, but there's a little flap that actually directs food down your esophagus that prevents the food from going into the trachea. And that little flap is called an epiglottis. So when someone is choking, it's because the food, that little flap hasn't properly deflected the food into the esophagus. Because what it's supposed to do is supposed to cover the trachea when you're swallowing. But sometimes that doesn't happen, right? And then accidentally food goes into your trachea, and that leads to choking, right? But if it's working properly, the food should go down your esophagus and then enter the stomach. And it might stay in there for a few hours. And then it leaves the stomach and enters what's called the small intestine. So this is all small intestine. Okay. It's quite long. It's about 20 feet long. And then after the small intestine, it goes into the large intestine, which is this. This is the large intestine. So the large intestine is actually shorter than the small intestine. It's about 6 feet, but it's thicker. And then whatever you don't absorb, well, we kind of know what happens to that, right? It exits. Okay. So this is an image of your stomach, you can see food entering. Make this bigger. So you see the food is actually being moved into the stomach. Now, the food is actually pushed. So there's remember we talked about tissues. So there are muscle tissue that actually moves the food down into your stomach, which technically means that gravity's not moving the food down in your stomach, which means you can actually eat standing on your head, which I don't recommend, not a good idea, but it's actually being forced into the stomach through muscles contracting. And then the food will be sitting in the stomach for a while. Then eventually it will go into what's called the small intestine. So here's another image of your stomach. So the food will be sitting in here for a little while. Now, we talked about the stomach when we looked at the different types of tissues. Remember, we looked at 4 types of tissues that, we looked at epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and nerve tissue. So you can see some of that in this image here. You can see for example, the epithelial tissue, because the stomach has very, very strong acid in it. HCl, hydrochloric acid. The pH is around 2, so it's pretty acidic. So these cells actually, they're not really flat. They actually fold up like this, and that gives them more surface area. So what they do is they pump out HCl and other digestive enzymes to help break down food. Now, because the stomach is very acidic, it also has to have protection from its own acid. Otherwise, it would digest its own walls, which wouldn't be a good thing. If it does that, though, that's actually called an ulcer. So sometimes what happens is if the stomach wall gets damaged, the acid can actually leak through and cause an ulcer, which could lead to, a bleeding ulcer. So you could get some blood coming out. Now, the stomach normally doesn't do this because it has a mucus covering that protects the stomach wall from the acid. But there is a bacteria called H. pylori that actually disrupts this and could lead to ulcers. I know a friend had it. It's pretty painful. I've never had it, so that's, Anyways, okay. After it leaves the stomach, and it's in there for a few hours, it enters, we said, the small intestine. So here's an image of the small intestine, all right? You may notice that you see these little, they look like little fingers. You can see them like this. Well, it's not a smooth surface. It's got these projections. Again, that's to increase the surface area. So it's kind of like what alveoli do. Remember, alveoli are like little bubbles. So that creates a high surface area. And we know the higher the surface area, the faster the reaction rates. So for the respiratory system, a high surface area means a faster rate of absorbing oxygen. But for digestion, we're not absorbing oxygen, we are absorbing nutrients. So you can see that there's a lot of folding going on here. You can see all this, right? All that folding contributes to a really, really big surface area that allows for a really good absorption of nutrients. Now, these structures actually have a name. They're called villi. All right, so they're called villi. And you can see they look like little fingers. And again, just like the alveoli, so the alveoli, remember, they're like all these little bubbles, right? And those bubbles give you lots of surface area. The villi also provide lots of surface area because there's a connection there, right? In terms of what villi do, their job is to absorb nutrients. Okay, we're going to talk about, I'm going to come back to actually how they do that in a second. After the small intestine is the large intestine. Then the small intestine is quite long, but it's not as wide. Large intestine is shorter, but wider. And what it does is it absorbs mostly water, okay? But what's really cool is that living in your large intestine are very beneficial bacteria. And those are bacteria that actually should be there. So they live there. Their job is actually to break down things that you can't break down, so things that you cannot digest, because you can't digest everything. There are things that we can't break down, like fiber, for example. Fiber is undigestible stuff. Then what happens is those bacteria might be able to break some of that material down. So this is actually an example of what's called symbiosis. You might remember this from last year. This is specifically mutualism. This is where two things work together and they both benefit. So what happens is the bacteria are given food from you, things that you can't digest, so they benefit. And in return, they actually produce some pretty important vitamins for you back. All right, so it's a neat example of a symbiotic relationship called mutualism. All right, so the large intestine, reabsorbs a lot of water, and it's home to some very important bacteria, which allows you to reabsorb also some or get some nutrients like vitamins. Here's an image of your large intestine. Okay, remember it's not as long as a small intestine, but it's wider. Here's a cross-section image of it. It's also called the colon. Should mention that. So the large intestine is also known as a colon. All right. Oh, there's a question in the chat. What causes colon cancer? That's a great question. What causes any cancer? So usually what causes cancer, so there are two things. One is genetics is an important factor, but it's also environment too, right? So if you remember, cancer is when cell division is unchecked. So cells have to divide because we know that things get damaged, they need to be replaced. Or when you're growing, cells need to divide so you get bigger, right? But there's a balance between cell death and cell birth. When there's too much cell birth, then that leads to cancer. Now, why that happens? Well, it usually comes down to things called mutations. Now, these mutations will affect two types of genes. The two types of genes, I'm just going to call them, I'm going to say the gas pedal and the brakes. Now, why am I saying gas pedal and the brakes? Because think of cell division like a car. There are genes that act like the gas pedal, which makes the car go. These are the genes that make cells divide. But then there are genes that make a car stop, that make cell division stop, okay? So when everything is balanced out, the gas pedal genes and the brake genes, they work beautifully, okay? So the gas pedal genes will tell cells to divide, but then the brakes will say, okay, now stop dividing. Now we have enough, right? So they work really nicely together. If there's cancer, and by the way, there's so many of these gas pedal and brake genes. When we have cancer, it could be a combination of genes that promote, obviously, too much movement in the car, right? So why would there be too much movement in the car? Well, that could be too many genes, like the gas pedal genes, that are working in overdrive. So it's like pushing down on the gas pedal more than you need to, or genes that make the car stop. The brakes, they don't work as well as they should. So there could be any combination of those issues. So some, genetics plays a role. Like, you might have certain gene profile, based on your family history that makes you more at risk to accumulate certain mutations that will affect these types of genes. But it could be also an environmental thing. We know that there are certain environmental things that lead to cancer because they cause mutations, and there's a link. They're called carcinogenic, right? That's what that term means, carcinogenic. So if this happens in where your colon is, then that could lead obviously to colon cancer. Does that answer the question? Okay, you're welcome. And that is actually not an easy, because I know colon cancer, there is like family history that is, they look at family history. If people in your family have colon cancer, then that puts you in a higher risk category, which means, again, there's something in the genetics that says you're more at risk to acquire these types of mutations. So you'll have to get screened, I think, more frequently. Okay. Now, so in terms of like the pathway of digestion, that's basically it, right? But in terms of actually chemically what's going on, so I want to kind of focus on a little bit of the chemistry here. So let me zoom in on this so you can see it better. Okay. So in terms of what's happening, you can really think of digestion, the act of breaking food down, really occurring in three areas. Okay. So one is the mouth, stomach is the other one, and then the small intestine. Okay. Now, most digestion you can see happens in the small intestine, right? Most of it does. And remember, this is where we also do the absorption through the villi. All right. Those are the things that are the folded things that allow for nutrients to get absorbed. Now, so the small intestine is the most important one, right? Because you can see most of the digestion is happening there, and all of the absorption happens in the small intestine. So technically what that means is if you, for instance, consume a meal, it does not necessarily need to be digested in the mouth or stomach. If it's like a simple sugar, that would actually only be digested, for example, in the small intestine. So let me explain that. So you can see the mouth will digest certain things called polysaccharides. These are basically your starches. Okay. The stomach breaks down protein. I don't know why I'm writing protein because it's right here. Okay. The things in blue are what's called the enzymes. These are the chemicals that actually break down the starches and, for example, the proteins in this case. Okay. So salivary amylase would start breaking down starch, whereas pepsin starts breaking down protein. But I can see that most of my digestion actually happens in the small intestine. So for example, if let's say I drink lactose, okay? Now when I say drink lactose, I guess I'm thinking about milk, all right? So if I drink milk, now milk does have protein in it, so milk would actually start getting digested in your stomach. But let's just focus on the lactose, all right? What happens to the lactose? If you're lactose tolerant, that means that it doesn't get digested. That lactose doesn't get digested in your mouth, doesn't get digested in your stomach. It actually starts getting digested here. There's an enzyme called lactase that breaks it down. Okay. If I, for example, table sugar. So table sugar is called sucrose. So if I take table sugar in water and I drink it, it doesn't get digested in the mouth. It doesn't get digested in the stomach. It only gets digested in the small intestine because there's an enzyme called sucrase that breaks down the sucrose. So you can see that most of this happens in your small intestine. Not all of it, but most of it. So the job then is to break down the foods into the smallest possible units, which are actually these three things called monosaccharides. Those are really, really small sugar units. To break down protein into its smallest sections called amino acids, and to break down fat into things called fatty acids and glycerol. All right, and you can actually see that fat itself doesn't get digested in the mouth, doesn't get digested in the stomach. It actually starts getting digested in the small intestine. Okay. Now, this is actually also summarized here in this image, which kind of highlights everything. So you can see that, we have, here's ingestion through the mouth. You can see that we have digestion of carbohydrates, as we talked about. Now, this says that there's some digestion of fat, but it's very minimal. So I'm not sure about how much fat digestion there would be there. Then you can see the food would travel into your stomach through the esophagus. So there's no digestion in the esophagus. In the stomach, we have proteins will get digested. Now, this says fats get digested in the stomach, but again, I don't think much fat would get digested in the stomach. I'm assuming what they mean by these is what's called physical digestion. And that is not chemical digestion. So what that means is that when you chew and you add saliva, or when the stomach is moving around, it's physically breaking up the bigger pieces of fat and making them into smaller pieces. I'm assuming what that means. But there's no chemical digestion going on here because they don't have the right enzymes to do that. Once the food is partially broken down in the stomach, it then goes into the small intestine. Okay, so there's the small intestine. You can see that. And this is where you're going to get the digestion of all the nutrients. And this is where you get the absorption. So this is really the most important organ. This is where you get, once you break down all the food, this is where you absorb it all right, in those villi, those little finger-like projections. And then whatever you don't absorb goes into your large intestine. Again, you absorb water there, and you get some vitamins from the beneficial bacteria, and then, you poop it out. Okay? That's how your digestive system works. Okay, hold on. Let me just exit the screen. I do kind of want to mention one last connection between the villi and the alveoli, but does anyone have any questions about the overview of digestion? So I mentioned that the villi and the alveoli share something in common, that they're both folded, which gives them very high surface area, which I said is important because the bigger the surface area, the faster the rate of diffusion. or in this case, absorption. And some of it would be by diffusion, by the way. So remember, we actually talked a little bit about cell transport. We tie it back to cell transport. We actually looked at how some of the nutrients like glucose gets across. Remember the sodium glucose co-transporter. So we talked a little bit about this, okay? Or the GLUT transporters that bring in glucose. Okay, if you don't remember that, I guess you could take a look at those presentations from cell transport. But in addition to being folded and having high surface area, one other thing I want to mention, actually two other things, is they're also very thin, just like the alveoli, and the blood vessels are very close. So you can see that they actually have three things in common with alveoli. One is just like the alveoli. Oh, I'll just wait for this to come up. So the alveoli, remember, are the little grape-like structures in your respiratory system. And the villi are the little finger-like projections in the small intestine. So they have three things in common. One is they're both folded for a great, really big surface area. And they're both thin, and blood vessels are close. And these two things mean that the nutrients or the oxygen get into circulation fast. And we talked about this before with the respiration. So if you remember, the blood vessels are like basically very, very close, and the membrane of the alveoli is very, very thin because we want the oxygen to get into the bloodstream as fast as possible. And it's the same thing with the villi. The blood vessels are very, very close, and the membrane in the villi are very, very thin because we want the nutrients to get into circulation as close as possible. And that's what you're seeing on this slide. Okay, so that is just like a really brief overview of the digestive system. There's a lot more to it than this. Like we didn't go over the accessory organs. Like there, for example, the liver plays a role, the pancreas. So a lot of these chemicals, for example, come from the pancreas. Let me show you, like these would come from the pancreas. Some of it actually comes from what's called the gallbladder. So we didn't really go into too much detail about that. I just wanted to give you an overview. You'll go into a little bit more detail in grade 11, okay? So let's stop there. Next time we meet, we'll go over some examples of conditions, diseases, and maybe we'll even talk a little bit about certain types of diets, okay? So let me stop recording now.